great pleasure to welcome so many people here to our institute. For those of you who don't know, this is the Royal Anthropological Institute. We're quite an august and old society in our way, but we only bought this building in the 1980s, which means we don't have something which is quite as big as the Royal Geographic Society. Nevertheless, it's very nice to have it at all, because it means we can have wonderful events like this. I'm also the chairman of the Anglo-Turkish Society. My name is David Shankland, for those of you who've already met. And this is one of our regular events, a lecture on some aspect of Turkey. And it is a testament, I think, to the importance of the work that Canon Sherwood is doing in Istanbul, that we have this large and interested audience with us today. I'm sorry about the heat, so let's start straight away, and we'll finish absolutely the latest at 2 hours after we start. But if anybody has to go early, of course we understand that.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
5 minutes before that. Thank you. Well, thank you, David, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you to Corinne Conrad, who initially suggested this. I don't know if she's here or not. I know her daughter in Istanbul. Anyway, I think that's what started this idea going, and thank you to your institute as well for hosting us. Now, a friend recently explained that to give a lecture, the lecturer had to have an overhead projector. Otherwise, the audience cannot concentrate for more than 8 minutes. 8 minutes is what they generally say now. And we can hope that this gathering, looking around, is a little more grown up and can transcend the current anthropological menopause of the human mind. And then if you do get bored, there are all sorts of interesting pictures to look at. Now, one of the great moments in life was in 1993, when hundreds of people turned up for the re-consecration of one of Britain's principal national memorials to those who'd fallen in the Crimean War. The memorial is, of course, built as a church, and the English church authorities, with her usual lack of sanctity or sacramental life, seems to adore desecrating churches by selling them as nightclubs or supermarkets or fancy apartment blocks. It seems to be mostly apartments these days. And this act she likes to call de-consecration. I'm not sure if anyone here was at were you there, Bill, at the reconsecration of Christ Church? No, you weren't. I had a feeling you were there. This positive moment had been preceded by a moment of realization in 1991 that the rising diplomatic culture of the European Union, as many of us experienced it at the consulate, Her Majesty's Consulate General in Turkey, was for EU countries to seem to divest themselves of their spiritual history. Come in, Ali. There's a seat here. So there seemed to be a policy of divesting themselves, European consulates, of their spiritual history. And possessions, churches, building, very important in Turkey to have a building to identify yourself as something inconsequential in the modern world. And even treasured buildings, schools, hospitals, clinics, divesting themselves, European countries divesting themselves of these important buildings and contributions to Turkish society as it was in the 70s, 80s, 90s. And the abstraction of our national identities, warts and all, was something detached from all that contributed to our historical culture. And anything that distinguished the identity of one nation or empire over another was now philosophically and politically null and void, as the new bloke on the block, gradually called globalism, took hold of our institutions. Such old things as churches or memorials could simply be dropped. And the church seemed very keen on this. In 1993, some diplomats, I should say Her Majesty's Consul General, he was invited by the church wardens to attend the ceremony of this controversial reconsecration that seemed to defy the material trends of the day. And that invitation, of course, was a little naive. But here we were, other countries were busy shedding or rewriting history, so the Consul General sent his regrets. He couldn't attend. He was going to the opening of a new pub. Now, Jeff, wherever you are, we've nothing against pubs. Jeff has written a history of the British pub. But he was off to the opening of the Sherlock Holmes in the suburbs. It was, for me, it was a Brexit moment. I'm nervous of saying that in London, of course, long before the current process was even conceived. The same Consul General was photographed by the press dancing barefoot in the new pub in Etteleur while we were having the church reconsecrated. And he was cool, of course, and fetching for the "we're all cool" gossip columns of the Turkish press at that time. And it was, of course, beginning to become upwardly mobile and buoyant, that period before the current situation. And cool Britannia met cool Turkey in a pub. There was no need to remember the horrors of ordinary men who had fallen in a fiasco of human suffering on a great scale. So you see, we got to this cultural idea that it didn't matter about what had happened because, oh, it's 130 years ago, as it was then. And that pub, ladies and gentlemen, has since closed its doors. The Crimean Memorial was reconsecrated regardless, and history took its rather uncomfortable stand. The Crimean Memorial still stands and remains a forward-looking institution helping to bridge friendships in a small way and bridges between people in Turkey. And the pub grew rather old-fashioned very quickly and was surpassed by later fashions of drinking and entertainment. And cool Britannia has given way to a reasonably anxious Britannia, at least very anxious in Notting Hill, where the vicar was going to make a speech about it on Sunday. And cool Turkey has fallen to a backward-looking, old-fashioned despotism that adores concrete. So the Bosphorus has been concreted all along the Bosphorus, the front that you know in Tophane, Emelulu. It's all going to be a fancy, new-looking front, but it's been concreted. And I'm happy to report that I think one of your predecessors, Sir Timothy Dormant, was very supportive in 1993, did send an army representative, the DA from Ankara, and quietly hid the letters from Bishop Satterthwaite in a drawer, unanswered. He opened them, looked, and didn't respond, because of course the ambassador was very happy to have the building restored. Nowadays, the British Consulate General, still suffused with dreams of EU ideology, has taken down its European flag from the Palm Court. But it must come to terms with the language and ideas of Brexit. And the Church of England chaplaincy in Istanbul, of course, doesn't have to do that. He's an Irish citizen. It took a great effort on the part of our little community to hold back the Istanbul authorities, the municipality, which was very eager to have the building, and to restrain the bishop at the time, who was eager to be rid of the building. And the same man had previously deconsecrated it as far back as 1972. But here we were in May 1993, having fended off those who would make us vanish from history desperately trying to stop the rain coming through the roof and the tower from falling down. To struggle against an all-pervasive abstract ideology that wishes to divest itself of its patriotism, nobler institutions, and substance-based values is ironically to discover that we live in a society, Turkey, that deeply values its great national and religious buildings, and curiously has, like the ever-dreaded Russia, made mammoth efforts, astonishing efforts, to recover and restore and even rebuild its spiritual inheritance and its magnificent buildings. You go to Süleymaniye and see the mosque and Mimar Sinan buildings, beautifully restored, very well restored. So everyone's critical of the cement and the concrete, but there are these great things that have happened. Not only does Turkey value her great buildings, she also even tries to emulate them on the banks of the Bosphorus with an enormous mosque to greet all the cruise ships that will come down again in the future. And of course on Taksim Square, where, as most of you have been in Turkey, of course, in Hagia Triada is that lovely 1860s Greek Orthodox church in the corner of Taksim Square. Well, right opposite the other side of Istiklal, an enormous, rather graceful mosque has been built. So, you know, Turkey is very proud not only of its historic buildings and some of its churches and mosques, but it's also creating them. Now, the Crimean Memorial is a British national memorial. And the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, often feels long eclipsed by world cataclysms that have occurred since this memorial was erected. And the memorial was first consecrated as a church in 1868, 14 years after the war itself, in which there were hundreds of thousands of casualties, including the Russian, Ottoman, French, Sardinian, and United Kingdom combatants. And what war indeed is not a travesty of civil or international incompetence? And the Crimean War, of course, is no different. The Crimean War became infamous as a notoriously incompetent act of international butchery. And little did people realize what was to follow only 60 years later with the Great War. The Crimean War was to reveal so much about the change that was coming on Europe. The decline of the Ottoman Empire, which had launched Islam into Europe, and now, according to the effervescent allied Turkish commander Omar Pasha, mistakenly reported to the Caliph that this war was an act of new jihad. So the Turks, the Ottomans, saw it as a great new jihad that was going to revive Turkey. And then there was the resurgence of Eastern Orthodoxy and Russia's own aspirations as leader of the Christian Orthodox East, and notably the first major critically documented reporting of war. All these came out of this war, thanks to the first serious professional journalistic and photographic presence on the front line of war. So this is what began to happen with the Crimean War, a properly documented war. And the Times correspondent, an Irishman, William Howard Russell, was to divest the British Army of any self-romanticism at the time, as he spoke plainly of the glaring weaknesses in sharp contrast to the standing permanent French army established by that time. Young soldiers would arrive on the battlefronts, catch infection or even cholera from the local water, and be dead 2 nights later, after which their graves would be dug up by the local Russians to steal the blankets in which the soldiers had been shrouded in their graves. Now, 10,000 soldiers died within the first 4 months before even one shot was fired. 10,000 soldiers died of dysentery before one shot was fired. In October 1854, there was the famous battle, the infamous Battle of the Night Brigade, resulting from misunderstood orders from Lord Raglan to Nolan, in which the cavalry rode right into the Russian cannon fire. You know all these things, I'm sorry to go through, but it's a necessary start to talk about the Crimean Memorial. This horrific fiasco was immortalized at home in poetry as an act of valor, which it truly was by the 600 or so cavalrymen who had been so mistakenly commanded. They just rode straight into Russian cannon fire on horses. And nonetheless, what was a fiasco for the Ottomans and their British and European allies was a double fiasco for the Russians as they retreated from their grander aims to reclaim Christendom, the great city, for Christendom, the great city of Constantinople. And it is ironic to note in 2018, 150 years after the Crimean Memorial was consecrated, that Russia, even after its 20th century Soviet catastrophe, would still be a thorn in the side of our rather self-confident ideologies of liberty and progressivism, and that journalism would have descended from the realism it gained in the Crimean War to its current set, predictable pieces and an astonishing politically correct conformity on the BBC and in other broadcasters. The journalists during the Crimean War expressed themselves without any national authority, censor, or even market self-preservation. And these journalistic critical reports, all of which you can read today, nonetheless were held up by Stratford Canning at Pera House until Lord Raglan's reports, official army reports, could be dispatched by Stratford Canning and reach London first. So there were different mailings going on. And Lord Raglan, for his part, depressed by his inability, after a catalogue of failed battles, to capture Sevastopol, succumbed to dysentery and to deep depression. It's very sad to read about, only to die in 1855 before the war ended. Now, with a British victory against the Russians far to the north in the Baltic, things began to turn for the Allied armies in the Crimea. And it was the sheer tenacity of the French and the British that eventually wore down the Russians and led to the final fall of Sevastopol after a siege of 345 days. Now, those were the days when European tourists would come and watch the final days of a war, because everything was played according to rules, which they did as the city of Sevastopol fell, and people like Jonathan Beard's family would have sailed up across the Black Sea and watched the final assault and drank champagne on board and been able to go to the hilltops nearby, see what was going on. And we might note sociologically that for every 100 British soldiers, 6 wives were allowed to accompany their husbands to the battlefront. What do you think of that, Bill? The most famous of these accompanying wives was Fanny Jubilee. Has everybody read Fanny Jubilee and her diaries? Oh, well, that's good. I was sure you knew all this. Fanny kept a diary, which is said to be one of the many invaluable sources of material for the war. In March 1856, the appalling war came to an end, and the all-essential destruction of the Russian fleet finally took place. And all this was, of course, to defend the seat of the Ottoman Empire, Constantinople. In doing so, Russian power now lay diminished for a further 2 generations, and not surprisingly, the British Empire, with its naval fleet, gained unrivaled power in the rest of the world for the following few generations. So there was great method in the madness and transaction of this war. France also gained. She regained her credibility as a premier European nation, for a few years at least, under Napoleon III, and the Crimean War was, however, France's only victory in the 19th century. If one looks on the bright side, of course, Russia used the post-Crimean War period to modernize and to work for the abolition of serfdom. And the Ottoman Empire survived, like all other empires, only to split apart with the inevitable rise of multifaceted nationalism. The First World War was truly the end of the old world, albeit some limped on afterwards, but it was the Crimean War which was that early moment of convulsion that was to ripple through time and change the map of Europe, the Ottoman Empire, and the old powers forever, the beginning of the end and the start of the new. The Crimean War was characterized by one terrible sin on the part of the British administration and some army officers: the unspeakable suffering of ordinary soldiers used as cannon fodder had the added horror of being starved because of government bureaucracy in Whitehall holding up approval of food shipments. So people were literally starving on the battlefield. And for this horror, how marvelous that out of all this mess, this heroism and the ferocious slaughter came Florence Nightingale with her famous world-diffused legacy, a legacy we see at the heart of so much healing today. At Scutari Barracks, I can't believe these figures, but everyone says it. Miles of beds in those corridors on each floor of Scutari Barracks, 18 inches apart, 4 miles of bed, 18 inches apart, and men rarely with more than one arm or a leg, gangrene, suffering infection, fever and cholera, all those things. Florence Nightingale managed to bring hospital management, as we understand it today, to the thousands of wounded, thus spawning the idea of medicine which many modern public hospitals around the world could do with emulating today. And administration, cleanliness, and ward discipline were the ingredients of the Nightingale advance. Thus, when the Crimean Memorial was finally built in 1858 to 1868, it took 10 years to build, it was built not only as a memorial for all who fell in such a catastrophe, but as a shrine of penitence for after war, a place of prayer for future generations, and ironically, but don't tell anybody, a memorial of Western Christian cooperation to save the weakening Islamic world from belligerent aggression. Now that's the sort of coined history, and that's the introduction. Would you like to take a seat? There are other chairs. Anyway, real historians here no doubt have read the 8 volumes of Edward Nolan's history of the Crimean War. It's well worth getting if you can see it. I'm sure it's not here, but it's a real treasure, and happily the chaplaincy in Istanbul has the first edition of that. Now, the first donations for a sacred memorial came from the Bishop of Gibraltar, from Lord Stratford de Ratcliffe, and Queen Victoria. Initially, it was thought that such a building could serve the many British seamen that came to the port at Constantinople. And in that first generation, Christchurch, to use its proper name, served as a parish church of sorts to those various sailors, British traders, and others who were outside the usual embassy chaplaincy social circle that met at the embassy chapel. There was a problem raising funds needed to build such a building, so a committee including the Duke of Cambridge and the Duke of Norfolk, as well as the Bishop of Oxford, initially represented the leading lights in promoting the appeal. Thus, with an initial fund of £17,000, the committee set about announcing architectural prizes for the best designs, and the prize winners were Burgess, followed by Street and Bodley. Now, Burgess visited Constantinople and was very disappointed with the tiny site that the Sultan had given, and his church had to be changed and changed. It was very elaborate, quite Byzantine, but they just couldn't afford to use the plan. So anyone who knows Cork City and St. Finbarr's Cathedral, that beautiful cathedral in Cork City, that is our church. That is stolen. It's the Burgess plan got built in Cork a few years later on a much grander scale than was intended for Constantinople. But I'm quite jealous now that I know that fact. I only learned that last week. So anyway, Street's design, G.E. Street, you all know who he was, and Jeff gave a lovely little lecture about him recently in Istanbul. His design eventually was chosen, as it was more typically Western Gothic and representative of Western church architecture. And at the same time, Sultan Abdul Majid had granted the land on which the memorial was built. It was 2 vegetable gardens he kindly seconded from the locals and gave to Queen Victoria. 4 days before Sir Stratford Canning, now Lord Stratford de Ratcliffe, departed the Sublime Port after most of 40 years in the city, it's an astonishing career, he laid the foundation stone of the memorial. And it was a momentous step in the Ottoman Empire to have such a symbol of the freedom of conscience for which Stratford Canning had been such a champion, right at the heart of the Muslim Caliphate. You know, tell that out in Kuwait or Saudi or wherever. Canning naturally commemorated all who had fallen in the Crimean War as he spoke. His speeches in the London Illustrated News. He also spoke about the victory of the freedom of religious worship, a freedom that still exists in a confined sense in Turkey today. Now clearly the Sultan, Caliph, was happy about the new church and even sent a prince of the royal household to attend the consecration ceremony. The stone to build the church was brought from Büyükada, Prinkipo, and most of the decorative stone was shipped from Malta. Finally, the church was consecrated on October the 22nd in 1868. It was a remarkable thing for those days to have many senior Greek Orthodox prelates present or represented, and most noteworthy was the presence of a Roman Catholic priest. That was very unusual in such times for a Roman Catholic priest to enter an Anglican church. The church has played an active part in ecumenical endeavours ever since, not without its shades of grey. And clearly, too, the church was seen as a symbol of a new cooperation in Constantinople and of friendships between the Sultan as a senior Islamic figure and the Church of England or Anglican presence as the most geographically spread non-Roman Catholic church in the world. Some often say that the memorial was built in fashionable Pera, but we know from Charles Curtis, my predecessor, the first chaplain of the church, that the back street on which it was built was notorious for theft and social disturbances and minor riots. By 1880, every householder in the area was reported to keep arms in his house to protect himself from the invasion of dangerous intruders. Self-protection, a subject of considerable debate today in any free society. Happily, things have moved on in our neighbourhood, and for the most part, Istanbul feels rather safer than London. Now, I see there are Anglican priests here today. I wasn't expecting as many of those. But I do recommend a taser in a vicarage. A Taser's very good. I have one. They sell them down the street from the church. And they're excellent for keeping people at bay in the vicarage. By 1880, the beautiful pulpit was installed. And by 1885, the rose window had been installed. Now, the pulpit contains a circle of porphyry found on Halki Island, Egoli, and the green serpentine decoration came from the shores of the Seraglio Gardens. The pulpit is inscribed with 3 mottos symbolizing Eastern, Western, and Reformed Christendom. And most of the pulpit marbles contain pieces originally found on the sites of the 7 churches of Asia Minor, the churches of the Apocalypse. So, you know, it's a great sort of ecumenical expression. And the east window, which was badly vandalized in the 1970s and was temporarily patched up in the 1990s, James remembers that, depicts the head of Christ at its center, grouped around 4 lights showing symbols of the evangelists, and 12 outer lights showing the heads of 11 apostles and a Judas window. Now, happily, we've removed 2 of the round lights to be restored as part of our 150th anniversary conservation. We're hoping over the next few years to keep that going, and thank you, some of you here have contributed to that, and I'm very grateful. As early as 1883, now 1868 it was consecrated, 1883, believe it or not, the building was suffering serious dilapidation, because Street really hadn't thought what the weather was like at the confluence of the Bosphorus. And the church tended to serve people of humble means, as it mostly still does, and few of the wealthier Brits in Constantinople were very supportive of the church. And little has changed culturally. Rain poured into the church and the roof was already becoming rotten, and it must have been very disturbing for poor Canon Curtis, who not only helped to create the building in the first place, but was the first resident chaplain who lived long enough to see the building going to ruin. And of course that's been the story of the building. It's constantly needing things and going to ruin. There's something about the wind and the huge golf ball hail and the things that fall on Istanbul, and then the intense hot summer that makes wood change and organs go through terrible struggles. By 1889, Canon Curtis was in England, a bit like me coming here today, only he was appealing directly for funds to help restore and maintain the Crimean Memorial. He went around parishes and institutes in various places, but he described in his speeches dramatic lightning strikes to the building. There was terrible lightning in the 1880s. And damage to the church from gunfire from the neighbouring houses. And there are all sorts of things that do look like gunfire on the building when you know these things. He also described crumbling heavy masonry falling on the people below. And by 1889, the neighbourhood had descended into terrible decay and terrible situation. Frequent murders meant that the original very low walls and wooden gates were not sufficient to provide protection to the church and its priest and community. Canon Curtis's appeal to help rectify the teething problems of this grand project fell on deaf ears. He went back to England very miserable and disappointed. In the following year, however, the big guns were pushed into action and the Duke of Cambridge solicited funds, and fortunately many responded, and by 1892 the repairs were complete, and basically we get the building as it is now, with good strong stone walls around and a proper parapet that saves tiles falling on people below, and all sorts of improvements were made. Now, 4 years later, Canon Curtis died after 34 years of outstanding ministry in the city. And in 1991, his plaque, you see, had been removed at the deconsecration. So in 1991, we put the plaque back in its original place. You could still see the outline on the stonework. This beautiful brass plaque in his memory was put back in the Crimean Memorial. It was a grave sin to have removed it in the first place. And his grave is in Haydar Pasha, a beautiful grave that many of us have seen. Now, from the year that Canon Curtis died, the SPG, what is that, Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, in London, ceased to pay the stipend for the priest, the sexton, the organist, and other basic expenses. So the UK-based organisation that had helped create such an institution as the Crimean Memorial in a Muslim society, unaware of the peculiar realities this would involve, abandoned their project, paying a very nominal sum each year to whatever priest would agree to be chaplain. This arrangement completely ended in the 1980s, and only recently in January 2018 this year did the same organisation, SPG, kindly agree to pay the modest sum of £1,000, a one-off figure, towards the hostel heating, which in reality is a 51st part of our budget. Anyway, beggars can't be choosers. We were very happy to get £1,000 towards the heating of our refugee hostel. And gradually, in the first quarter of the 20th century, the British population of the neighbourhood dwindled, and in 1911, notwithstanding such decline, an hill organ was installed in the new West Gallery. There's an oak gallery in the west end of the church. The Great War, starting in 1914, meant that many of the British households in the area were evacuated, and even by families that had lived there for generations. Remember, there had been a British community in Galata since 1582, and only a few British households remain there today. Mary Berkman's one of them, and Umit and Rosemary, I suppose, count as a British household in Galata. Very few. And then in 1914, the chaplain, at the outset of the war, the chaplain departed for the armed forces to serve as a chaplain to the armed forces. Now, there is an interesting note in the register for 1916 that at the Christmas midnight service, the Turkish police brought 12 British officer prisoners of war to have their Christmas communion, and 3 British civilians who were under sentence of death. A Turkish guard stood to attention as the priest quickly prepared and officiated at the service. He wasn't going to have a midnight mass, but it wasn't so fashionable then in Anglican churches. And the 3 prisoners were under the impression that they would be led to their execution immediately after the service. But we've no idea what actually happened. And Chad Kusmaker dug that little detail out. He dug lots of details out of the registers. During the early years of the 20th century, the chaplain at the Crimean Memorial was also officiated at services in Ferikoy Cemetery Chapel in Yeşilköy, and even up the Bosphorus at Kandili. By 1914, the chaplain had left to serve, as I've said, in the war, and a new chaplain, Father Wigram, held the fort at the Crimean Memorial. Now, the Turkish authorities arrested him, deported him on a charge of espionage to Çorum in 1917, and the church was shut down by the police late in 1917. And anybody who knows Turkey well will understand that such charges of conspiracy or espionage are not unusual, even today, when an innocent Baptist pastor has been held in Izmir jail for over 550 days, isn't James? James is the chaplain of Izmir, and recently was served with a bizarre indictment of 62 pages and a possible prison sentence of 32 years. And his case has come to court but been postponed yet again this week. I think it was on Monday. So you know, these things happen, and clergy get used as pawns from time to time. This man is a simple pastor. It's so unlikely that he was committing espionage against Turkey. Now, Mr. Trump has kindly tweeted about him. Some of you who follow his tweets will have noted a fulsome tweet about the pastor, which draws world attention to this man, because although it's in the press, a lot of people don't know about it. But when it goes out on a tweet, millions of ordinary people read about it. And wars always brace people spiritually. Something as hellish as the Great War certainly did that. And there was perhaps consequently something of a spiritual revival after the First World War. And one chaplain, the Reverend R.F. Burrough, even managed in the 1920s to organize the making and importation of an English oak rood screen. I mean, it's unbelievable sending a rood screen, we couldn't begin to do it today, installed in memory of those who died at Gallipoli. And that rood screen is a national memorial to those who died at Gallipoli. And the rood screen shipped from England took 3 years to obtain from customs, the customs authorities in the new Turkish Republic. And by 1923, bearing in mind the Greek-Turkish War, 1922 to 23, the fine rood screen was rescued from customs, and the chaplaincy was charged a fortune by the authorities for having stored it. Nothing changes. On September the 30th, 1923, General Harrington attended a farewell parade service at the church with officers of various battalions, and the Union flag that had flown over the British headquarters was presented to the church for safekeeping. And we still keep the flag today and show it on Remembrance Sunday. We have some very precious flags, but I won't go into that because it is hot and I'm tired. Now, after the Russian Revolution, for some reason, Christchurch was used for Russian services. So many Russians lived in and below Galata that during their liturgy, they trailed up the steps of our church, there's a great flight of steps, and right along the street towards Galata Tower. And of course, as you know, in that wonderful way of Russian liturgy, the making of the sign of the cross and the bowing, well, this moved like a wave up the street and along towards Galata from the altar in Christchurch. You know, astonishing days, and this was recorded by one of the chaplains at the time. And so it was, anyway, the point I wished to make was it's marvelous that the church that was built as a memorial to a war with Russia was then opened its doors to the people of Russia who were caught in Istanbul. In 1924, the undercroft of the church, originally a schoolroom used by Anglican nuns for teaching children, was turned into a small chapel. And it was this chapel, derelict in 1991, that was to become the refugee hostel. Our current project is to assist Christian refugees from Pakistan. And please bear that in mind. For years and years, we've helped people, Hindus, Muslims, Roman Catholics from Sri Lanka, Chaldeans from Iraq, and various Shiite refugees from the regime in Iran. But we're trying now to help Christian refugees who are really at the bottom of the pile in the UNHCR in Ankara. And if they say they're a Christian from Pakistan, they're not given a second interview, and they're always interviewed by people dressed in ideological Islamic dress. So I feel as chaplain, and the wardens feel that we should be trying to reach out to just this handful of people that we do. But the handful is constant. So we've had over 2,500 people staying in the hostel over the years. Throughout the 20th century, the Crimean Memorial lost its resident congregation. The neighborhood became worse than it had ever been. The buildings became more and more derelict until its final deconsecration. And it was stripped of its furnishings. And the altar was hacked up. And the pulpit survived and the font, thank God. The pigeons moved in. The organ was pulled apart by vandals. The windows were smashed, the important windows. Much of the roof was in disrepair, and the handsome bell tower was on the verge of collapsing. And against the wishes of the local municipality that wanted to take over the grounds and the building, and against the wishes of the Bishop of Gibraltar, who wanted rid of this Victorian white elephant, he constantly called it that. In 1991, the local church community, using the consulate chapel at the time, started housing refugees in the undercroft of the Crimean Memorial. And quickly this led to the re-establishment of divine service in the ruinous church. And after many battles with the diocese, the church was reconsecrated in May 1993. So for the past 26 years, we have refurnished and beautified the church as best we could. The tower has been restored largely thanks to a dinner party we had in London a few years ago. The bell rings again, the altar has been rebuilt, the rood screen has been decorated beautifully by Mungo McCosh with saints of the British Isles, India, Africa and Constantinople, and the organ has been restored and regular liturgy is offered again in that sacred place. Our latest endeavours for the 150th anniversary of the first consecration are to conserve and properly restore the broken rose window and the large stone porch at the west end of the building. Hence this lecture and David's kind invitation this evening. It helps to broadcast the news a little bit. Having a noble Anglican church at the heart of modern Istanbul is part and parcel of the cosmopolitan fabric of such a great city, despite all that we must endure by way of little support from the establishment, which seems caught up inside its former paradigm of being a sub-branch of the EU. The Crimean Memorial is an enduring bond of friendship between two great former empires and two striking modern nations which have at times blundered, at times flourished, and both of which have not been afraid to strike out in new directions, for good or ill. And it is a peculiar culture indeed that wishes to shut itself down or divest itself of the building blocks of our culture and the essence of our identity, for which so many lost their lives, both in the Crimean War and at Gallipoli. Hence, it is the congregation of refugees and exiles, friendly Turks and expats, that endeavour to conserve and promote a knowledge of our history, our presence, and something of the English landscape in downtown Istanbul. We try to keep the church open most days of the week, and we survive mostly through alms and fundraising events. Every now and then, when needs arise, we seek to raise awareness of our special building, and we do so in memory of those who died in the Crimea and at Gallipoli. We also do so for the perpetual worship of Almighty God, and we do so not out of some narrow nationalism, but precisely because in our cosmopolitan identity and inclusive culture, we actually have something to contribute. But please do not tell the Foreign Office under whose auspices we work. It will take a while for them to re-emerge from their last 4 decades. Now, a quote from Roger Scruton, I can never finish without a quote from him. I think that human beings are incomplete without a concept of the sacred. They must have a sense that this world in which they live has moments, places, events, people, which are in some sense standing outside the ordinary course of events. In such buildings as the Crimean Memorial, we have an unexpected Istanbul building. in an unlikely place, erected in memory of thousands of brave Ottoman, French, Sardinian and British citizens, made sacred by all who worship there, and, as Scruton says, quite outside the ordinary course of events, but just a little outside. And thank you for coming tonight, sitting during this hot lecture. The only person who is not allowed to ask questions is the Reverend Canon Dr. William Taylor. He threatens to ask embarrassing questions.
But indeed, let us do take questions. So I think probably you're fully able to handle the questioning from yourself. So why don't people who would like to ask a question raise their hands so we can...
I just wanted to ask a bit, I was really skating over this, about the unprepossessing location, because I discovered it by accident. I was just walking around the block, and they're in a pretty rough neighbourhood. That was in the deconsecrated period.
Yes.
So the Sultan gave the site, but he couldn't have been all that enthusiastic to have given us such a site as he did.
Well, Lady Canning, we have to blame her. You see, they were offered a site up behind Galatasaray School, which was right up on the crest of the hill. And in those days, there weren't those tall apartment houses. They only appeared at the turn of the century, 6-story houses. So when they chose that site because it was just above where British ships came in at the mouth of the Golden Horn. And when it was built there, it was clearly visible standing. It still is visible to those who know how to look for it. But it was on the hill above the port. And from the downstairs windows of the parsonage next door, you could see the Bosphorus. So its original location wasn't hidden away as it is now. It was halfway down the hill, but halfway up there.
Can I ask what's the relation between the Crimean Memorial Church and St. Helen's Chapel?
Yes, it's one chaplaincy. So the chaplain is chaplain of St. Helena's Istanbul, which is the consulate chapel, with Christchurch. These were added, of course, Christchurch, Pera, and All Saints Moda. So it's one chaplaincy with 3 buildings. Yes.
It's a rather dull question, but the answer will interest me, I think. Your relationship with the municipal authorities and indeed with the government in distant Ankara, do you have any special privileges granted in the 1860s or subsequently, or indeed any special impositions? Do you, for example, pay rates?
No. Churches, we don't have to pay for electricity in the church. There are certain privileges like that. But the Anglican chaplains in Istanbul are, they're under the auspices of the Foreign Office. So that takes you outside the normal way of things, like the Greek Orthodox, the indigenous churches. The Roman Catholics have various solutions to this. But they too struggle when they have a priest coming. What identity is the priest given? What residence rights? So it is a bit of a problem. So if I wanted to have an assistant or somebody working for the church, cleaning or a secretary or whatever, it's very difficult to get permission for that. So we lunge about the place. James has recently come to Izmir. And again, getting identity, there's no recognized form. So previously, one of the chaplains was there for a long time, Geoffrey Evans, and he was chaplain to the embassy. So he was organized. But then once he left, all that seemed to fall apart. So it's very difficult identifying ourselves. The mayor, by the way, is quite friendly and quite proud that there is this church there, though he won't assist in any way. I have invited him to tea. But that's about the strength of our official recognition team.
And free electricity.
Can I just say something? If you have a building that
that predates the Turkish state, you're very lucky in the sense that your kind of existence isn't questioned in the same way that if those groups that have set up churches subsequently are in a more precarious situation. But I think precarious is the word. It's not that it's impossible to do, but it's just not very secure. So we have a copy of our firman on the wall in our hall, the Sultan's firman giving the piece of ground.
Oh, right.
Put it on the wall, which, you know, because it's the most important document we've got.
Yes.
It's the permission to build a church on that spot.
Yes.
Can it be read
Yes.
by the current?
Well, there's a very convenient Turkish translation next to it.
But having the physical building, of course, as James says, is your identity. You're there, you exist. But it doesn't much help if you want to go and set up a bank account. And everyone has to have a bank account. But we skirt our way around all these things and survive. And I suspect even at the height of the British Empire, it was still difficult. And you were getting the root screen out of customs, wasn't it?
Fantastic.
Any other questions?
Are any of the other consulates, chapels, running? I was just thinking that outfits like the Russians, who the relationship with the Russian Orthodox and the Church and the state is very strong, have they sort of reintroduced anything there?
The chapel in the former Russian embassy, now Consulate General, has been restored. And I think they invite a priest to come and celebrate sometimes there. The main Russian presence is on the tops of those the pilgrim hostels down in Carrico, and there's a Russian monk in residence there. But he's only a tourist. The only other consulate that maintains a link is the German one, with the German Protestant and the German Roman Catholic Church. But that's very ropey now. The Germans want rid of their connection with their chaplaincy. Fortunately, for all the secularism of the British establishment, it hasn't happened with us. There's still some connection. And we have a wonderful new ambassador who's made sure the chaplain in Istanbul gets invited to things when he comes to town. And I think in Ankara, the chaplain there's a new chaplain there, I think. And he, certainly the Persian chaplain was there, gets invited to functions. So there is a connection that goes on. Well, yes.
Is the Hyder Pasha Cemetery still used for Protestant burials?
Oh, now this is a very good point. Not just Protestant, but historically it does have Hindus, Roman Catholics, Muslims there, because soldiers were from all faiths. But it's beautifully kept. It is accessible. It's possible to get in. But we had a question from Mr. Thompson recently. Over the past few years, he's been corresponding. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission are making it very difficult for people to be buried there. And he was writing on behalf of his sister, who wants to be buried there. His cousin is here today. And the consulate, believe it or not, with me, we've been battling to have permission to bury people there. And there's plenty of space, and there's no reason why, especially family members associated with that place, should not be buried there. But it's one of those modern bureaucratic things in Britain. You're directed to links on websites, and you can't deal, even with the Commonwealth War Graves now, used to be in the Dardanelles there. There's always this bureaucracy hiding behind links and no human face. Yes.
Ian, do you foresee more difficult times ahead in the light of the growing authoritarianism of President Erdogan and his government?
Well, I think Sadly, yes, I do foresee that. But we tend, you know, in a society like that, Bill and I served in Bucharest together in Ceausescu's last years, and Bill was the defense attaché there. We tended, we tended to live in a bubble socially, of course, but we came out of that bubble for various reasons. And that's the way it is in Turkey. We sort of go on trying to be quite normal, but we know that you hear more and more awful stories. Like 1 week, a month ago, I read 84 people, mostly housewives, had been arrested at 5 in the morning, their doors not banged open, taken from their beds, taken off, because they'd been on social media, Twitter and things, complaining about the invasion of Syria, just ordinary Turkish people, and arrested and taken in, some of them still held in jail. So that is a bad turn, and there are more and more stories. I know it's not a popular station, but there's some American Freedom Today or something. They did a very good documentary this week with all the statistics about what's happening in Turkey. So it's disappointing, but there are still lots of expats have left Istanbul. The chaplaincy somehow or other continue. We've grown, well, James's church is thriving. Mine has grown a little bit in recent months. We're not quite sure why, but there seem to be expats. Americans, of course, won't come. Most Europeans don't visit Istanbul anymore. With a lot of Gulf Arabs. And the main language on Istiklal Caddesi, the main pedestrian street, is Arabic. So, I should let you go to bed. Yes, please.
Do you have any links with any particular regiments who are involved in the Crimea?
No, we don't. We've had various people. Robert Noel was the one who, you know, the Herald who did. He did a bit of research on it and thought he'd make that his project. But of course, as you know, they've all been amalgamated. Yes, it's quite hard to trace things. But it was one. We're doing our best. It works quite well as a church community, trying to battle to keep something together. Part of the work of the Holy Ghost. Philip, no questions there. Philip was a great friend of Bishop Satterthwaite.
You said that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission was making it difficult to bury people at national park. Why is that? And what have they got to do with it?
Well, the reason, it sounds ridiculous, and I'm sure, I'm only quoting the British consul who was dealing with it. They told her that their gardener was not insured to dig a hole. Just that. And when I rang, because I was so shocked by this, I said, well, I'll dig the hole. So I rang the chap, there was still a Brit who was based on the Dardanelles, rang the office, and he said, oh no, you don't understand how difficult it is. And I got my head, he shouted a lot down the telephone. And it is as ridiculous as that. In Turkey, you know, he's not insured to dig a hole. Don't die in Istanbul. You want to be buried in Hyderabad. Anyway, it's lovely to see you all. Thank you for coming. I was expecting a small handful of people around a table. It's very nice to see a congregation such as this. Thank you. Thank you.